Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's J Talks live event in honor of International Women's Day, Game Changers, the Rising Profile of Women in Sports Media. Thank you for being here for this timely conversation with the women journalists and editors covering one of the most widely followed and accessible areas of news media. We are grateful to our exclusive J Talk series sponsor, TD Bank Group, for making this conversation possible. Our thanks also extend to our in-kind supporter, Cision, and to CPAC, our broadcast partner for this event. While we're meeting on a virtual platform, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today. The Canadian Journalism Foundation's office is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and we are privileged to live and work in these territories. A quick reminder for our audience, our program today includes a Q&A session, so feel free to submit questions for our speakers at any time using the tab on your screen. And to learn more about the CJF's work and upcoming events, you can visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. Now let's talk about the state of women's sports coverage. The launch of the Professional Women's Hockey League last year, and here in Canada, the Toronto Tempo's WNBA debut set for next year, are game-changing moments in sports. Women athletes have a passionate fan base that's growing exponentially, and these new leagues are responding to that demand. But even as interest soars, media coverage still lags behind. It's time to change that narrative. We're excited to welcome a distinguished group of trailblazers who are leading and shaping the coverage of women's sports. It is my honor to introduce our stellar panel. Shireen Ahmed is an award-winning senior contributor with CBC Sports and an internationally recognized sports activist focusing on the intersections of racism and misogyny in sports. She teaches journalism and sports media at Toronto Metropolitan University and joins us from Toronto. Rachel Brady, also in Toronto, covers sports for the Globe and Mail with a special focus on in-depth features. She has reported on issues including gender equity and athlete abuse and has profiled some of Canada's biggest athletes. Megan Johnson recently stepped into a new role as an executive at Dome Productions. With her background in covering women's soccer for TSN, she'll play a key role in the inaugural season of the Northern Super League. Sarah Ziegler joins us from New York, where she is the sports content editor at the New York Times. Throughout her work, Sarah has been dedicated to expanding coverage to include more sports leagues and women's sports. She's also a proud fan of the WNBA world champion, New York Liberty. And leading today's conversation is one of Canada's most recognizable journalists. She's a thought leader, global speaker, award-winning news anchor, and also a valued CJF board member. Welcome, Farah Nasser. We're honored to have such an incredible panel with us today. Farah, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, we are among these esteemed group of trailblazers, as you mentioned. I'm so excited to get into this topic, and we already have audience questions, so I'm going to get right to it, if that's okay with you, ladies. I want to start by how sports has changed and evolved, and I feel like it's happened so recently. Like in the past 5 years, things have really changed and evolved. So I want to start with this question, and I'm going to go around just as a level set. What's one change that you think has really stood out to you over that time period? Rachel, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess we can start with the sheer number of things we have to cover in terms of women's professional sports on a daily basis. 5 years ago, I think predominantly the things we had to cover at the professional level were really a tennis event in summer in Canada and a golf event. And then, we had Olympics, we had a spotting of, World Cup alpine and winter sporting events that would take place in Canada. But beyond that, maybe a world championship for women's hockey. There wasn't a lot of pro sports, and all of a sudden we've had loads of new with the PWHL, with now a WNBA team coming here next year, with the NSL about to start just months from now. It's not only given us something to daily talk about with athletes right in market, but it's opened up a broad range of even business stories to talk about the economics and the investment and just lots of other ways that other people have been involved in the landscape. And it's just like a burgeoning ecosystem really in Canada for women in sport.
MJ, I'll turn it over to you next. What's one change that you want to highlight?
Sorry, was that to me?
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear my name. Apologies.
No.
I think it's just always about pushing forward. I think, we highlighted obviously the great strides that have been made so far, and it's not being complacent with that. It's always striving for more. I think of my time at SportsCenter as a producer, where what I like and the changes I've seen, I've been involved in the newsroom since I was an intern in 2007, where it's just there's more openness and there's more conversations around women's sports. Whereas it's not, if someone brings up a great game or a great highlight, it's not, well, are people really interested in that? That's not the default mindset anymore. It's, well, if people aren't, we need to tell our viewers that you should be interested in this, that these are great athletes, these are great leagues, they're great games. And we as journalists, as broadcasters are helping to educate our viewers as well that, these are athletes, these are leagues that you need to pay attention to because there's some amazing stories here. So I think it's just, as I said, it's not being complacent we've come so far. As we know, there's still a long way to go when it comes to getting as close to equality or equity as possible in our coverage of women's sports. So it's just keep pushing those storytelling opportunities forward as much as we can.
I love how you said equity, because I think that's such an important thing as opposed to equality. There's a lot of work to do to get us to that level with women's sports. Sarah, I'm going to go to you next because we're talking about the Canadian scene, but I'd love to understand your perspective from the US. What do you think the biggest change has been in your mind in the past 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, the 5-year break is really interesting because that happened, that's right around when COVID hit, which there was a huge change then that we realized how the broader public realized how poorly women's sports were being treated. The year in 2021 when Sedona Prince showed the terrible the weight situation for women's college basketball at the women's college basketball tournament. And people were like, wait, what is that? And everyone who knew college basketball was like, yeah, this has always been what it is. But the women's college basketball tournament couldn't use March Madness branding until just a couple of years ago. It's been so stark, the change. That tournament, I'm a huge women's college basketball fan, obviously, and I couldn't watch every game of the NCAA tournament until recently. Probably 2021 was the first time we could. They would show like snippets of games, whip around coverage on ESPN. You couldn't watch a full game. Now that they realize, oh, people want to watch this, of course, people do watch it, and ratings are through the roof. It's like, we've been telling you this. But now that we don't have to make that argument anymore, now we can move on to the other arguments to make about how we cover women. It's not the argument of people want to watch it. They seem to get that now.
Yeah, sure. And I'm curious about your perspective because you really focus on intersectionality as well. So women, coming from different communities, sometimes marginalized communities. How have you seen that? I know there's a long way to go still, and we'll get into that. But in the past 5 years, what have you seen in terms of the main difference?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed and I keep track of is who's reporting on what. And the Women's Media Center that's based in New York has said like they do report cards. And at one point, 2021 was the last one, and it was in the United States anyway, 89% of those in sport media were white, able-bodied, cishet men. Now, Canada, I think the number would be slightly higher. So there's a less diversity racially and gender-wise. And in terms of gender expansiveness, it's really not in Canada particularly wide. So I think those are the things. But in the last 5 years, in addition to COVID, one of the most important moments, I think, in a reckoning of sorts for sports in general was the murder of George Floyd. And that became apparently clear how ill-equipped people were to have discussions about race, and sports being an incredible vehicle to do that. I mean, for those that don't know, the WNBA players were protesting way ahead. They literally created a blueprint for how to do it, whether it was racial justice. They were talking about it ahead of anybody else. And I think these are things and pieces of history that we should retain and know. One of the biggest changes is the amount of jobs that have been created in media, and hopefully we'll see more young women in these spaces, because what that lends to is the topics that are discussed. And women's sport have always been a place for activism as well, whether it's the PWHL, the NSL, the WNBA, certainly, and other even amateur athletes. There's always this element with women, in my experience, where they're not just athletes. Men have this privilege of just doing sport. Women have to justify their existence. They have to be thankful for the coverage they get, but they also are often talking about whether it's, anti-homophobia or, the anti-Blackness that's rife in certain places. So they come with something. And very recently, something I wrote a column about too is soccer players from around the world united to write a letter against Saudi Aramco and their principles, and they didn't feel comfortable. So this is something that comes with women's sports very often, is their activism, which is also being spoken about in this space. Because as we know, for a very long time, this industry didn't want to mix politics with sport. Not that sports weren't inherently political, they have always been, but that people were reluctant to do that. So in the last 5 years, I've seen a shift, which is a good thing.
You talk about how female athletes are not just athletes, right? There's so much more to them. And the other thing that research shows is that a lot of sports coverage focuses on their appearance, on their personal lives. Do you feel is still an issue right now, Shireen?
Well, appearance-wise is really fun for me because I've sort of been pushing back when I was younger, and I think I'm older than everybody on the panel, but you couldn't be sporty and be feminine at the same time. And we're seeing this incredible pushback, whether it's nails or lashes, lash extensions and hair done. Like, it's beautiful. You can exist as you are and how you want to be. And femininity is strong, whether it's Alona Meher, like in the body presence, you can be beautiful and strong and big and not just have to be slender and in a particular way. And I think that's really important. And I think that has been changing. For example, Cameron Rogers, a gold medalist in hammer throw, who I had the chance to cover during the Olympics. She's stunning. She's a stunning athlete and person and beautiful person. And even the idea that a hammer throw athlete is gorgeous. Like, I love this discourse, and I hope it keeps evolving and sort of like not aligning people and I like sort of labeling them. I think we're, you've mentioned and MJ said already, the equity piece. We still have a lot of work to do there. So I like how the conversations are unfolding. Sephora is a founding partner of the Toronto Tempo. So the fact that there's a professional team here and their founding partner is a makeup company, I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I guess, Rachel, my question is, and I'll turn it over to you, is it distracting? Like, are we seeing, maybe male sports reporters, or people still focusing a lot on appearance, on women's personal lives in a way that they wouldn't with male athletes?
Yeah, certainly I think that can sometimes be in the branding, right? Whether or not that comes with endorsements and things like that. That brands may be looking for a certain look or a certain gender or whatever it is that they're looking for in terms of marketing their product. I think the leagues have done a really good job of saying, we have different identities, whether it's in appearance or lifestyle or the LGBTQ presence in the leagues too, like that athletes are allowed to be who they want to be. And in women's sport, that narrative has really pushed forward. We're getting to see women are open to telling about their personal lives. And that comes through more and more in the storytelling that leagues and athletes are doing on their own social media and with their fans. And a lot of behind the scenes stuff that we see that these leagues have come out of the gate being really good at, actually, on their own side and being really open about it. And in turn, that has turned to embracing and bringing in fans and allowing them to see themselves in that too. And I think also on the nails thing reminds me of, I literally did a story about fingernails at the Paris Olympics this year, because it was not a sign of, oh, I can't break a nail. It was exactly the opposite of that, which was, it is really empowering for me to come out feeling esteemed and stylish and like I am in control. I can be who I want to be here. I don't have to explain to anybody if I want to look a certain way or express myself through what I wear and how I wear my hair and how I do my nails. And the athletes men and women, by the way, were wearing nails that they were really proud of and that were patriotic, and they were almost being used in sort of a message sort of way, or a patriotic way of like feeling good about coming to the starting line. So I think that just totally flipped that narrative on its ear, really, about style is okay. You're okay to show your identity coming into the tunnel of your sporting event and being exactly who you want to be.
Yeah, I mean, Megan, it wasn't so long ago that we saw that twirl happen, right? Was it Jeannie Bouchard?
Bouchard, yeah. Give us a little twirl, yeah.
Right. What I wanted to ask you about, though, was more the idea that women are often perceived or told that they're role models, right? So female athletes are role models to other girls. What kind of pressure does that put on them? And does that do a disservice?
I think it certainly can. I will say there is a place for that narrative and that discussion. To use the example with the Northern Super League and the NSL, as I'm doing work ahead as executive producer, obviously heading into that first game, that is going to be part of the narrative, because there's finally a professional women's soccer league in Canada after so many years. So naturally, some of the questions going to come up is, well, now, setting the example for young girls, young boys that can look to these athletes now. I think the issue comes when that narrative continues after that fact, or it becomes like a default, basically. And it's almost like an instance where you kind of wonder, maybe there's not enough research being done into these athletes about what they're doing on the field or off the field, for that matter. And it's just, oh, okay, well, let's fall back on the athletes as role models narrative. Use example again at Women's World Cups, where I've covered a few. And with the Canadian national team, I think without fail, I've heard that question asked to Canadian national team players as they're heading into a World Cup, which, I mean, the focus should really be on their performance on the pitch and what they can do, and can they win a major tournament or a World Cup. And it's just not something that is asked of male athletes a whole lot, if at all, quite frankly. I can't think of the last time Austin Matthews was asked about being a role model for young boys. And again, to use the example of the World Cup, the Canadian men's national team at the World Cup in 2022, first time in 36 years, they're at a men's World Cup. And again, I can't recall any of the male players being asked about being role models for young Canadian boys or girls being at a World Cup. So I think it does a disservice, because it takes away from their performances on the field or whatever sport they're playing. And again, it's not all on the field, because we talked about these athletes as advocates, and obviously that's a huge part of what they do as well. But I think the disservice part comes in when it's just, that's, as I said, the default narrative that I think too many journalists still fall back on.
Sarah, I see you're nodding your head. So get in there. I'd love to hear your perspective on this and how you pick stories, right? Because you're responsible for picking stories from The Athletic that are going to go into the New York Times.
Yeah. I think what Megan said is so true. It's that default falling back on how do you see yourself to these little girls, and not the game. And I think that is another thing that we do see changing a little bit more, that there is more willingness to just cover these women as athletes, and not need to cover them as, you have to represent your gender in the world. No, it's just, they're athletes. Let's cover this game. Let's write about this game. And you do see still a little bit of that falling back, but more of the game. And I think, the conversation about appearance, the women have owned that. And that is how that has sort of changed from that, we're only going to talk about their appearance because we won't talk about them as athletes. Now we're going to talk about who they bring to this game, how they are representing themselves as they play and are kicking ass as on the field or on the court or whatever, which I think is a great positive change. And frankly, people could ask more questions of the male athletes, how they bring their authentic selves to the games. I would love to see that kind of shift too. So it's all around. But yeah, in my role at the Times, I'm really lucky because I get to, so I fill the Times print section every day, their sports print section, and I get to draw from the entirety of the work done by The Athletic. The Athletic produces like 100 stories a day, roughly, plus stories that are done by the reporters at the New York Times as well. That is really exciting. It could also be really overwhelming because there's so much to choose from, but it allows me to build a really comprehensive report of the full sports picture. And to choose, stories from lots of different sports, and give kind of, give our readers a full picture of what's going on in the sports world. And we're lucky because The Athletic does a great job covering women's sports, from the WNBA and women's college basketball to women's soccer to the PWHL. We ran a story earlier this week about the first fight in the PWHL, which I found so interesting. I didn't realize there had never been a professional women's, at that high level fight before, and how the women approached it. And I found that so fun because like fighting is just a thing, right, in hockey. And so to talk about that for in the women's hockey was really great too. So it's a fun job to get to pull from all of that stuff and not have to justify why I want to use a women's sports story. I just get to do it.
I love that. Shireen, I want to turn it over to you. I mean, you have done, like I said, groundbreaking work when it comes to that intersection between sports, women's sports, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia. And I guess I want to ask you, what are the gaps? I know we've come a long way, and I know there's a long way to go. So what are the real gaps that still exist when it comes to sports coverage and race and other DEI issues?
I think that one of the biggest things I've noticed, and hopefully is changing, I mean, I teach at TMU as well. I teach journalism and sport media, and I've seen an uptick of racialized women in my classrooms. And I don't know if it's because I'm teaching that I find them coming to my section, probably. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but just even have people having those opportunities to get in the newsrooms and do the reporting and be producers and be camera people. I mean, at CBC Sports, one of our, awesome camera people persons is a woman, and you don't always see that. And I think that's also really important. And because what happens is, even if you're reporting on women's sports, a singular lens is not always the greatest. It's good to have different opinions of people presenting stuff. Like, I mean, between all of us on this panel, we would all report the same thing a little bit differently. And I think that's unique and that's powerful. And that's what gives media so much strength, and it's robust media, right? And we're missing gaps. Like, I actually don't know an Indigenous full-time sports reporter in this country. And I've been looking for one for a really long time. There are Indigenous reporters who do stories, but I'm talking full-time. And I've been looking for one for a long time to collaborate in this and, have, so that kind of thing. So there's still gaps in that way. I think that, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, and it could be a little uncomfortable, but I will say this, that the leadership of all the networks that we represent, there's no women on the leadership team. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think is it's 2025, and we need to see women in senior leadership in sports, and not just as reporters or as broadcasters. And I'm so happy MJ is EP now, because that's really important, but also we need to see people in the upper echelons making those decisions. And there are no racialized women there at all. And I think for me, those are big gaps, because when you're telling stories like this, it's really important to have trans reporters reporting on that, in addition to everyone else, queer reporters and people from different communities. And I mentor a student who's disabled and, just sort of feels, has a similar barrier that I have another student who's a non-binary student and also feels even just like there's not a place for them necessarily. And that's one of the beautiful things about what we do, is there can be a place for everybody.
Can I get in here? Because you mentioned this, MJ, by the way, congratulations. Very true. Very exciting that you have this role. But there's a question in the chat, and I think I just want to really get your thoughts on it, especially because we're talking about, trans people in sports. Jenny just asked, how has the shift away from all things DEI and, more worryingly, the active demonization of trans women in sport since the Trump presidency affected sports coverage in the media? And how is that received? And then, Sarah, I want to ask you about differences in Canada and the US with that. But yeah, Shireen, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, we just heard this a little while ago.
So, I mean, all of us on this panel have probably received abuse at some point, or sexist comments, and or in some point of a career. I mean, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I'm assuming we've all received some type of negative commentary. Mine also being layered with the xenophobia, gendered Islamophobia, etc. I have never gotten as much abuse has ever written on trans athletes, and the persecution of those athletes is so worrisome. Now, the only thing I will say about that, and I'm really clear in my position, I think that the media hysteria about this is distracting people from abuse in sports, lack of equity in sports, and so many other things. And I speak for myself when I say this, but I will tell you that very recently, when Quinn was signed, a member of the national team soccer program was signed to Vancouver Rise of the NSL, I asked them in an online presser, is the rhetoric and the political sentiment in the United States a factor of you coming back to Canada? I mean, their hometown is Toronto. And they told me that they would be remiss if they didn't say they know it existed, but they would also be, have to admit that that same type of conversation and those discussions and that toxicity happens in Canada. So their advocacy is as important here as it was in the United States. And that really stayed with me, because I think we need to be a little more uncomfortable in Canada than we are. And we tend to placate ourselves to think that we're great, but racism and homophobia, anti-Semitism, transphobia don't stop at the border. They continue and they go forward, and it's embedded deeply into systems in Canada. And I think we need to pay attention to that.
Sarah, talk to me about the States. I mean, just hearing Trump's address on Tuesday, it was really unbelievable. I've never seen anything like that. But when you heard that, what has the response been? What has it been like?
Well, one of the issues right now in the States is that there's so much going on that it's hard to get through all the noise of everything happening all at once. With it's just been kind of a fire hose. On the issue of trans athletes, though, this is going to be a problem. This is going to be a whole thing for a while. There's targeting specific states for not changing their rules. That Maine allows trans athletes to play with the teams of the gender they identify with. He's threatening to cut off federal funding, and all of that is a little hard to unpack, because what can he actually do? It's unclear. All of that is, but this is going to stay in the news for a while. I do think from the perspective of the media, it's been tricky, I think, because there are some reporters who don't want to write about trans athletes because it's such a small number of people, actually. And so bringing attention to those athletes has been seen by some reporters as being, doing them harm, possibly. Bringing attention to them has been a bad thing. But I think at this point, there's no getting away from, this is an issue. This is going to continue to be an issue. Good reporting has to be done on it. And I keep going back to telling the stories of real people. So often, right now, during the election in the United States, it was an issue that didn't really have, it was just like, this scary thing is happening, protect your girls, that kind of thing. No one was really talking to those athletes who are, just trying to live their lives. And some of it, the athletes don't want to, the athletes don't always want to be the face of whatever. And I completely respect that. But every time I've read a story that tells why sports are important to a person who is so easily marginalized and pushed out of so many things, how sports, really made a difference in their childhood or whatever. Those kinds of stories are so important to tell people, because then when people feel like they know a trans athlete, that makes all the difference in the world. If you have a person in your life who is trans, you're not going to take that kind of stance. And isn't that what storytelling and good reporting does? It makes people feel like they understand that issue. So I think reporters are going to have a huge part of this. Right now it's just this, just a fire hose of news, but there's going to be an opportunity over this next year to really tell these stories and break through on a different level, I think.
You know, you mentioned something, Sarah, that I think is really interesting about, you know, if we put a telescope or sorry, microscope on what's happening, does it make it worse, right? And you know, Rachel, you've done some incredible stories on eating disorders and sport, and I wonder if there's ever been a concern or you've ever gotten feedback in terms of undermining the cause because you're highlighting issues associated that might, you know, results in backlash or undermine, you know, getting more women in sports.
Yeah, I mean, they're uncomfortable topics. They are. I had to ask a lot of uncomfortable questions and have some, you know, some unsettling sort of interviews. I had a lot of athletes who said, I don't want to talk about that. It touches my life and I don't want to talk about it. And I had athletes come back and say, okay, maybe I will talk about it, or don't put my name behind it, or there was a whole range. But then there was plenty of people who said, I do want to tell my story. I think it's important to tell. I think it's important to look at things that need a spotlight on them, because the cultural around something like eating disorder or athlete abuse will never change if we don't take, you know, some hard scrutiny and hold some people accountable too, by the way. So yeah, they're difficult conversations to have, and maybe difficult reads, right? To read some of those things. And none of that reporting was done to be salacious or to undermine progress for women in sport, because by the way, we interviewed lots of men who also have experience and have seen and lived through eating disorders too. It certainly is not exclusive to women's sport. And it's one of many. It's certainly not a singular issue that women experience in sport, and not all women have that. But I think we have to apply kind of the same tools and skills to women's sport or any sport that we do to anything we cover, from news stories to politics, where we're holding leaders and decision makers to account about how they do things. And yeah, we're telling the good with the bad, and we're asking the good questions and the tough questions. And it's not to not highlight the positive. We certainly tell plenty of stories about progress and great positive good news stories too, and get to people's you know, feelings about things. But we're not meant to be a marketing arm. Of course, we all want to see women's sport survive and thrive, and for women to have equal opportunity. Who doesn't want that? Everyone wants that. But we also have to cover things in a way that's fair, and ask all the right questions, and tell things truthfully, and to not be a marketing arm of something, certainly, but to tell things accurately, and ask the right questions, for sure.
No, that's great. And you know, you were talking about highlighting some of the good. Megan, let me ask you, how do we make this growth sustainable? Like, is it just kind of like everything's happening right now and we're all excited? How do we sustain that and capitalize on it and the excitement?
I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying at the start, where not falling into complacency and to keep pushing forward, and to not be satisfied with the fact that, oh, you know, look how far we've come in 5-10 years. It's all about continuing those narratives and continuing to push for men's sports not to be the default in kind of every capacity of sports journalism and sports coverage, I think. And to look, you know, PWHL kind of a prime example, and with the NSL coming out as well, that these are professional leagues and that they deserve the same amount of coverage that we would give their male counterparts as well. You know, to go back to the Sports Center example, unfortunately, there's still sometimes I'm watching Sports Center, I'm like, why are PWHL highlights so far down the show? Like, let's move those up. So it's continuing to push those narratives, and as I said, just to not fall into complacency, because again, we can be happy. Like, let's clap and applaud. Yes, we've come a far way, but let's not fall into complacency and to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm going to turn it over to questions soon. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, feel free to write them down and they'll get to me. Shireen, I'm going to go to you next, because I'm curious on your take on something. So, you know, we've seen social media, we've seen the rise of digital media, streaming, all that stuff. Do you think it's been a democratizing force, or do you think it's kind of amplified inequities that exist in this space?
That's a great question. And journalism is meant to be dynamic. I love what Rachel just said about asking questions and not being a marketing arm. And that's so important because journalists, irrespective of the platform, still have the same ethos and practice. You have to be accurate and fair and make sure you're fact checking. And sometimes, and I believe in citizen journalism, I believe in independent journalism as well, but you have to stick to the process. You can't, like I see so often people just ripping stuff off from, videographers and photographers and not citing their sources. And I do believe TikTok and Instagram and all these things can be used. In fact, and Snapchat, in fact, and the major news organizations have Snapchat accounts as storytelling forms, and vertical and digital studios are increasing. I work a lot in digital with CBC Sports, and I do think we need to be dynamic in the way that we disseminate that information. But also, you have to make sure that you still observe the practice of journalism and that you do it in a correct way. And the difference between me and a pundit and a content creator is clear. That I am telling stories, and then even here, our digital producers are mindful of what they're using. There's rules, there's laws about you can't just rip off people's things. And I believe in the empowerment of voice. I think that I do really like people amplifying their own voice in whatever I do. I mean, I'll text my kids and be like, where did you get this clip? You have to cite it. They're like, Mama, please, please. And, then again, even the way that people share stories and the way that I know that when I started my career, Twitter was an incredible resource, and I am deeply saddened to see it descend into the abyss of fascism, if I may say that it has, because it was such an incredible tool of connecting journalism. I met MJ over Twitter. Initially, we connected through women's soccer and Rachel's work I'd followed, but some journalists aren't necessarily on social media as much, and Twitter was just a really great tool, and I'm actually very deeply saddened to see it not being able to be used in the same way that it was. It was a great tool, and I certainly connected with so many colleagues over it. So I do see a way and a space in which technology should and can be used. Just like AI, we have to be careful. It is a tool, and you have to use it properly. So I'm I preach a lot about that. I mean, I'm old, so I use literally a notebook and a pen to write things down. But I do think that we should be able to give way for students and aspiring journalists and to do whatever technology is easier for them. You can tell a beautiful story with just your phone now and capture the most beautiful shots. I was at the showcase for the PWHL when they played the All-Star game a couple of years ago, and I literally had a tiny mic that I bought online, and it was incredible how it was used. So we should be able to use those things and be creative. I mean, creativity is the foundation of what we do, and being able to move and pivot as need be. So, it's kind of thrilling and exciting. So I encourage people to do it, but just be very mindful of how you're using it, like anything.
I love what you said about punditry, right? Versus, because I don't think media generally, and it was one of the problems I had when I was in news, we don't give that distinction enough, and people get confused. They kind of conflate all that, right? One thing that I know, even in my reporting on race, I was accused of was advocacy journalism, right? And there's a real concern right now in terms of advocacy, mixing advocacy and journalism. How do you negotiate that? And maybe Shireen, I'll start with you, because I'm sure you've been accused of that.
Oh, yes, the objectivism. And there's, I think, something I'd like to highlight for people. Santh Matar, a former producer at CBC, wrote this beautiful piece for The Walrus that ended up winning multiple awards called, it was about privilege accorded to white journalists and what that means, and objectivity, the objectivity piece. And I've felt this in my own career, objectivity is something that's used as a gatekeeping mechanism. Women are often told, well, you shouldn't say this because it could mean that you're biased. I'm a woman, so I'm biased towards women's sports. What are we doing here about this? I do think that our ideas are our currency and the way we do them across, but like anything, we have a process. I've been told, I'm not ashamed of saying that I advocate for justice. I mean, if I do a piece on anti-Blackness in hockey, are you going to accuse me of not being racist? Is that the criticism I'm going to get? Okay, fine, I'll take it. Like what's happening here? And I think I come from anti-oppressive and harm reduction perspective in the way that I practice journalism, very particularly because I think it's important. And, Rachel can talk a lot about with survivors about how you speak with them and how there's toolkits that are offered from different places, be it on, consent comes first or toolkits on how to use words. Athlete Ally does an incredible job of this. And I've compiled literally all the toolkits I know I give to my students, and I'd be happy if anyone's interested to ask, the hosts of this event, and I'd be happy to pass it on. It's not stuff that I've invented, I've just compiled. And I think that part of what that is the objectivity piece is not knowing language, but also accusing people and preventing them from saying things. I mean, the Canadian media industry, is predominantly white and was that for a very long time. And I think that telling me that I can't do something is just a way to prevent me and scare me. And one of my mentors in this career, Desmond Cole, I texted him and I was like, listen, I'm getting hit with all these, you're not objective. And he's like, look, I'm transparent about my biases. It's what I do with them. And I'm not letting them affect the work I do. I believe in women having equitable place in sport, but I'm not going to let that affect the work I do. It just helps shape who I am. And I don't divorce my identity from the work I do. It's impossible to do that. I don't think anybody can. But what I don't let it do is I'm very good. We're all excellent at our jobs. There's no question. We've assembled an Avengers list. And, if I may be so bold to say, but we're good at our jobs. It doesn't mean that we're not asking difficult questions. We're not PR people. We're journalists. We're not here to be fangirling and making friends with people. We're doing our jobs. And I think that it should be accorded as such. So the objectivity piece is a reductive way to address that. Sorry, that was a massive rant. I do apologize.
No, it's not. It's funny you're saying this. I'm thinking back to the reporters during the civil rights movement, right? How they reported things, how they saw things about injustice and inequality, and were probably accused of the same kind of thing. But we know history, what it is now, and how that reporting was so important. I'm debating whether to go to now some student questions. I think there's a lot of students on this chat, but maybe I'll ask one more question before I do that. Rachel, how important is it for women's sports to be covered by women?
Wow. I would like to see anybody who wants to cover women's sport. I mean, I have seen early days, I suppose, decades ago, I guess, when I would cover a world championship or something like that, it would be mostly all women. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I'm looking at the PWHL, I see it's not just a couple of, it used to be sort of a couple of women who used to play hockey kind of thing, right? Who had maybe an interest or an expertise or connections, let's say. And now it's not that at all. In fact, there are men who have been reporting for a really long time and reported on lots of other things and are now covering the PWHL and are having a great time and are really enjoying it and finding it refreshing and finding just unique stories to tell. Having said that, I do think that I wish there were more women covering all sports, all sports. You don't have to be a woman to cover women's sport. You don't have to be like the people that you interview in any way, right? As long as you're respectful and fair and curious and willing to learn and be open to asking the right questions, I think you can cover anything. And I don't want people to feel a barrier, they're not welcome to cover anything because they didn't come from that world, or they haven't watched a lot of it, or they didn't play themselves, or they feel like they won't be welcome in the locker room. Please don't feel those barriers. And also, those of us who do cover a lot of women's sports, we're welcoming. You don't have to feel like there's a group of women over here with our arms crossed, you're not. Well, look at you coming into RB. Not at all. I think
you're excited about it. Yeah.
I actually flick little things to my colleagues. I happen to be the only female sports reporter at the moment at the Globe. And I flick stories to my male colleagues all the time and say, oh, hey, are you interested in this? And they're like, cool, great story. I would like to go cover that. So I like to think that I'm trying to enable or invite, or I guess make it a welcoming place for everybody to come. But I want to see more women for sure. Young journalists coming out of school wanting to cover women's sport. You bet I want to see that. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, Andrew has a question, and I think Megan and Sarah, you two are very equipped to answer this. You all are, but I'd like to hear from you two on this specifically. Andrew asks, some media organizations have mandated a certain percentage or share of their coverage to women's sports. What do you think of that approach? Sarah, maybe I start with you on this.
That's interesting. I think that could be helpful if you're a media organization that's not organically doing that has not, and that has struggled to put resources to women's sports coverage. If you need to set yourself a quota or, a threshold to get to make sure that you're doing that, then that's probably helpful for you. I think that though, it speaks to like, hey, if you see women's sports as sports, then if you're a good sports editor, you're going to cover them because they're sports. Like, so I think that's a little bit of antiquated thinking, and like you should get past that. If you need to give yourself, okay, I'm going to have this many, whatever a day, to make yourself incorporate women's sports into what you're doing, okay, great. But like, let's move past that and just cover women's sports as sports and not have to think about it in that way.
But are we there yet? I mean, MJ, you talked about the equity piece, right? What's your opinion on this?
No, I don't think we're there yet, unfortunately. I think, to Sarah's point, it's helpful, but yeah, you'd hope we are at the point or close to getting to the point where we're not covering sports just to hit some arbitrary percentage number, because that is that's the directive from on high that, oh, okay, I got to put this in because I haven't shown any women's sports or covered, whatever the case may be. So I think it's just kind of the overall mindset needs to change, and it has been. We've talked before about the steps and the progress that we've made, but it's coming to the fact where it's changing that mindset where men's sports isn't the default. And so it's not about, again, just hitting this, okay, I got to get 10% in here. It's like, let's look at both of these as equal and equitable options, because they're both great games, they're both great stories, and let's try to move away from, I guess, a crutch of, okay, no, I'm not at this number yet.
Okay. There's quite a few questions about, advice that you'd give emerging journalists. So maybe I can just go around with that one. Maybe pick one piece of advice, maybe a special set of skills or perspective, or a certain approach that you think young emerging journalists should have, or some thoughts that they should have in terms of entering this industry right now. Rachel, I'll start with you.
Sure. I get the question a lot from a lot of young journalists, and that, I think there's maybe sometimes still an old myth that like, oh, the locker rooms are a really scary place to be, and you don't want to be in there. You'll be treated really bad and stuff. And like, please don't let that bother you. Did I have those experiences 20 years ago? Yeah, a couple of those, but I think people are looking out for you these days. I think there's a lot of women in this field in Canada who have your back, I would say. I know that I've earned over the years, and I work for a paper that's well respected and all of that. So I'm coming at it from a different place as someone just entering. But I don't find that. I mean, I think there's a real culture shift around that kind of thing. So don't let that be something that scares you. And if you can be a good journalist, you can cover sport. So don't worry about knowing the rules and the history and the Wikipedia page of every single athlete and the statistics and all of that, and being some sort of expert or elite athlete yourself. Just worry about being a good journalist and having a good skill set that way. And you can just as easily go cover an election as you can go and cover a buzzer beater at the Super Bowl, if you have the right skill set and you're strong as a journalist.
That is mind-blowing. I was offered early in my career a sports job, and I was like, there's no way, I know nothing about sports. But that is so interesting to hear that you actually, it's journalism that you need even more than all these, all the
promise you could do it. I promise you. You're a strong journalist and you can apply that to sport.
Wow, that's mind blowing. Good to know. Shireen, can you tell me your thoughts in terms of what you give if there's one piece of advice?
First of all, take all the free pens you can. When you get free stuff, take the free food, when press boxes, take all of that. That's my first advice to students and aspiring journalists. Like, take it. I would even suggest bring Ziploc bags because sometimes they just throw it out. So that's the mom in me. I think the thing I was going to say was I love what everyone's been sharing, but also it helps when you grow your community. And I do appreciate what Rachel said about there are people in this community that will have your back, and they will. I've relied a lot on colleagues and friends in the industry. And when we were in Australia covering the Women's World Cup, I wanted to get a shot and I didn't get it fast enough. So Claire Hanna of TSN had it. And she's like, hey, as long as I gave her cred for the photo, she's like, here, like, everyone's there. We're not like, I mean, sure, there's competition in that sense, but like, we're all there doing the same thing. Like, there's a lot of more camaraderie than I think, that comes across. And I really appreciate that. And like, get a mentor. If you can, mentorship is really important, and extend your networks. If you are not on LinkedIn, I know you're like, LinkedIn. Yes, get on LinkedIn and network. This is so much about relationship building and knowing people and having access to people. And lastly, live in discomfort and be okay with it. You'll have to ask tough questions. You'll have to be in places where sometimes the questions you ask, like, trust your gut and ask those difficult questions, because sometimes they may be important parts of the story you're trying to tell. So just get comfortable with discomfort. It's okay.
And that's what make those uncomfortable questions are what make the best stories. MJ, you're in an executive position right now. What are your thoughts? What's some advice that you have for people looking for work?
Yeah, I will say I love what Shireen said about community, because it's so true. There's never been animosity where someone like, oh, you're with CBC or anything like that. It's just, it's so great whenever you're covering an event with reporters from other outlets. It's fantastic. But what I'd say is maybe the other side of that coin is to advocate for yourself. And that's kind of a piece of advice I've given a lot to students. And to use myself as an example, I started covering women's soccer. As I said, I came up kind of in the Sports Center newsroom and worked my way up the ranks. But I advocated for myself, because I went, hey, like, I know a lot about women's soccer. I know a lot about Canadian women's soccer. I think TSN, there's a bit of a gap in our coverage. If it's not a World Cup, we're not really talking about it. And I can write about this team. I can write about the players. I can cover the friendlies and everything going on in between tournaments. And I always give credit to the TSN higher ups, because I was never told no. They were on board and said, yep, absolutely, that's a great idea. And from there, like, I look at my career trajectory, and it's been fantastic, and obviously leading to the position I am in now with the NSL and executive producer duties. And that really, where I am now, it never would have happened if back in like 2016, 2017, I didn't say, hey, I can do this. I know a lot about this. I'm a strong writer. And so that's what I always come back to. And it's kind of fun now to look back, like, wow, yeah, I'm glad I had that conversation, because you never know what might happen and the trajectory it can take you on.
Well, have you, MJ? Joanne just asked, are there systemic barriers to women who cover sports in Canada that have not been discussed today? And I think what she means is the work environment culture equitable?
I think it is. Like, again, there's always strides and improvements to be made. But I've never, like myself, had issues or anyone, or felt uncomfortable, or that I wasn't good enough to be in the Sports Center newsroom, to be a producer, to be in the position I am now. I've never felt like anyone higher up than me or in a position of power has ever looked down at me personally because of my gender. Now, obviously, we've talked a bit about the social media side and all the fun stuff and toxicity that comes with that, but I can only speak from personal experience. I've never felt that those barriers have existed for me in the workplaces that I've been at. And that could just be me being very fortunate, and I recognize that. And not to say that they don't exist elsewhere. I'm just kind of speaking about personal experience.
Rachel, Shireen, either you have anything to say on that? Do you think there's any systemic issues that are stopping women in Canada specifically from being in sport? Have you ever encountered anything? And if not, that's okay. I'll go to Sarah, but I just wanted to make sure that I ask you that too.
I mean, I think it depends who you ask. I mean, as a racialized woman, I'm going to say yes. I mean, there's systems of racism that exist everywhere. They're embedded into this. I would be remiss if I didn't say that. I witness them. I see them. Like I'm really lucky and supported where I am, and I've been fairly lucky. But I was freelance for the majority of my career until I landed here. So, yeah, I mean, my answer to your question is it depends who you're asking. And with what level of privilege is that person replying? So that's my answer. Are systems equitable? No, but they're not equitable in any sector in this country. I have friends who work in economics and architecture, and the stories they tell me are terrible about the things they experience. Like, listen, architecture blew me away. Okay, I had no idea. And so it's not great. It's not perfect anywhere. But I think the point is it can be really good here. And, journalism as well is like, when you think about Canadian newsrooms and what they looked like 25 years ago, they didn't look like they do now. So there's hope, right? Like, I don't think we're there yet, but we're getting there, and we're not going to get there if we don't get in here.
This is great. And just in the interest of time, I want to bring in Sarah, because I think that the majority of people here are students. So they want to know, Sarah, you're in a pretty high position. What advice would you give right now to the students listening to us?
Yeah, I would say develop resilience. This industry has changed so much since I started, since we all started, and it will undoubtedly continue to change in ways that we can't even understand. So be resilient, know your talent, and believe that you're gonna make it through whatever bumps in the road are going to happen, because it just is gonna happen. And I would also say, don't go into your career with an established, a trajectory that you have to be in this kind of role by the time you're this age and at this kind of, a news outlet by this age. It takes just a wild, wandering path. And that is actually the beauty of it. So just collect experiences along the way. Don't compare yourself to where other people are. Just take what you can where you are and do the best journalism that you can do. And you're going to find yourself in great, great roles along the way, telling amazing stories. And that's really what it's about at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm good. Can I just add one piece of advice? Let your work speak for itself. Like, don't get involved in all the drama and this person saying this and this on this. Just let your work, do your work, let it speak for itself, and it'll speak for itself. One more question that I think is important, because some people who are listening to us are freelancers. And again, I don't have a lot of time, so I just want to go around. How do you get editors to notice you if you have a pitch for sports? Rachel, let's start with you.
Do something no one else is doing. Okay. And cover athletes that no one else is covering. And if we just heard about a perfect example of someone who knew soccer. She knew soccer. She put her hand up and said, I know it. I can do it. You can trust me. I know something other people don't know. I went and covered the Nagano Olympics as a student because I knew women's hockey, and I got myself there. So wow. Lean into the thing that isn't being done and put your hand up and say, hey, I could do it.
MJ, quickly, how would you take a pitch? What do you think is important?
Yeah, I'm gonna, not to completely cop out, but I'm gonna kind of build on Rachel's answer and just say, yeah, like, do your research, see what is out there, because like we've seen the coverage, and again, talking specifically women's sports, grow a lot, but see what is out there, and to the opposite of that, what isn't out there, and look for those stories. And maybe it's those personal interest stories where you're looking more behind the scenes and kind of taking a peek behind the curtain about what this athlete is like, or how, someone that has a great story. Like, to use an example, and again, I'm going to use soccer, but Megan Reid is a dual national, just got called up to the Canadian national team, got her first caps recently, but her story is fascinating. She actually quit soccer for a time, became a paramedic, was a full-time paramedic, and then decided, no, I'm not done with soccer yet, and ended up going to the NWSL, was an Iron Woman for Angel City FC, like played the most minutes of the season. So it's fascinating. And those stories are out there, and there are so many that are untold. So just look into those.
Okay, Shireen and Sarah, you have 30 seconds left each. So Shireen, quickly, what do you think? If people are pitching to you, what do you want them to to do?
I was relentless. Ask on people you know, ask for personal contacts of people. Hey, do you know this person? Be unabashed. I mean, part of journalism is you have to promote yourself and get those networks and hustle, get the grind. Do you know this person? Can you connect me with this person? To get my first byline at Vice, I lied, and it was on hijab bans in basketball, and I literally put naked vampire basketball at midnight just so the editor, who get 500 emails a day, would read my email.
Sorry, naked vampire
basketball at midnight, just so Tomas
I would click on that.
Tomas Rios did, and I had sent him 5 emails before that, and he never replied. They get so many emails a day. I'm not saying lie, but I did. But you got to be catchy about
lie. You put a different title. It's not really.
Well, do you know what I mean? Just so he would read my pitch, and then he wrote me back, "LOL, I'll give you $100, write it," and you got my foot in the door.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, Sarah, how do I pitch to you?
Do your research. Make sure you're pitching the right person. That is, I get so many pitches that I don't take pitches, and I'm like, no, sorry, you know. So make sure you're talking to the right person.
Okay, all very, very good advice. And okay, so that is great. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And if anybody has other questions, I can tell this group is pretty open. So feel free to reach out to them and ask any questions you have. On behalf of CJF, on behalf of our board and the organization, I want to thank you all for watching and being part of this. I learned so much today, and it was great to have you. Thank you, ladies. Shireen, Rachel, Megan, and Sarah. Really appreciate your time and your wisdom.
Can I take a picture of us really quickly?
Sure.
Okay, smile. MJ knows I do this all the time. So.
All right, excellent. Thank you all very much. Have a good rest of the day, and thanks for everyone.
Guys. Thanks, everyone.